Hey everyone, my name is Bryson Terrell. I'm a systems engineer with the Jamf Cloud engineering team, systems administrator with the Jamf Cloud engineering team. Oliver's one of our architects, no, the architect on the Pro Services team, the architect. All right, so show of hands, who was here at the session for webhooks last year? Cool. We are doing the exact same thing again. I'm kidding. We're not doing the exact same thing again. All right. This year around, we're really just going to do a quick recap of some of the highlights from last year. But then what we're actually going to do is, again, sort of talk about what webhook integrations look at a high level. We're not really going to dive into any code. But on top of that, we are going to touch on the importance of API documentation, which you'll understand when we get into what these webhook integrations with Jamf Pro look like. And then we're actually going to go over some real-world examples where, with one exception, all the code for this is already online for you to go look at. And then Oliver is going to talk through a solution that he built for a customer in much more detail than I'm going to do for the ones I'm covering. He's going to go through his start-to-finish process there. And then we'll try to wrap it up with some Q&A. All right. So, just to recap from last year, webhooks was introduced into Jamf Pro in 9.9.3, which would have been August, so it's been just over a year now that we've had access to this feature in the product. Webhooks are actually an API built on top of another API, which is the Events API, a Java API. Who remembers the Events API? Hey, we got some people here. I mean, you work for us, so you don't count, but we got some people here. So the Events API is actually a Java API, so you can write a jar file that registers for some events, and you load it directly onto the server. Webhooks are actually just built on top of this so that they will shoot out HTTP posts whenever an event triggers. And those will be in JSON or XML format. So as of 9.101, we have 18 total events that you can listen for in webhooks. But this one right here is being introduced in version 10. We have a new one for Computer Patch Policy Complete. So with the new patch policy feature in version 10, there's now a webhook to go along with it, which is similar to the Policy Complete webhook with a couple of differences. This is a little bit of a sneak preview right here for what those are. Just like the other ones, you've got the event key at the top, but under the actual webhook data here, you have not only some metadata about the patch policy that got completed, but that we also have this array of log output. So when a policy runs and you get all those different lines of output from when it's executing actions, you now have the logging for that directly in the event. So that's something that you can reference in your integration. And plus the full computer, that full computer snapshot that you would see for all the computer events is also nested in there, so you have access to that as well. So you know exactly which computer ran it. You've already got some details about that computer, and then you've also got all the metadata about the patch policy that ran. All right, we're going to talk real quick about integrations at a high level again, because this is something that people do still ask about because it doesn't always click. But really, when an event occurs in Jamf Pro, like an inventory submission, that's going to trigger something, and then you've created a webhook in Jamf Pro saying, on computer inventory, I want you to send a post of JSON or XML to this URL, and that URL is going to be whatever web service you have out there that's listening for inbound posts. From there, this integration that's received this event is going to go do something somewhere else, either locally or with another service, or maybe even back against Jamf Pro. Big example right here is notifications, chat services, Slack, HipChat, Microsoft Teams. You have events coming in that you want to have notifications of in one of your channels or rooms. You have it sent off there, properly formatted. The other thing it might do is it might actually go out and interact with other services in your infrastructure, such as CrashPlan, Splunk, or even go right back to Jamf Pro to do some automation action. And then there's also the further potential that whenever you actually perform an action, you want something to come back to the integration for it to do another action on, so that you have this workflow process that's all being kicked off by the triggering event in Jamf Pro. So a big question that always gets asked about is like, why doesn't Jamf Pro just work when I directly post to something like Slack? And the reason why is because one, there's always the chance that however Slack accepts something might change and then it'll break if it's built into Jamf Pro. But really the big reason is to cover the widest range of. It's hard to cover the widest range of options because this is just a top-level overview of all the APIs for all these services. HipChat requires authentication. It uses JSON, and it has this method for installing plugins. Slack does not require authentication for just sending messages for the most part, but it also uses JSON, and it has optional methods of installing itself into Slack Teams. Microsoft Teams, JSON-based, again, just like very similar to Slack actually. It doesn't need any authentication for inbound webhooks. CrashPlan Pro E, if you're interacting with it, it needs JSON, it needs authentication. Jamf Pro uses XML for any data that you're sending back to it, and it requires authentication for all its endpoints. And then Splunk actually takes in anything for the most part. JSON is what you would want to send to it, actually. That's a typo on my slide, but it also works off of parameters in the URL, and it requires authentication. So all these things work differently, and you're going to spend most of your time not really working so much with webhooks in Jamf Pro as you are working with other APIs after you get an event from Jamf Pro. So the event is triggering something that you want to do an integration with another service, and you're using their APIs. So going through the documentation, understanding how these services work, and then building your integration around them, that's where you're going to spend most of your time when we're talking about integrations leveraging webhooks. So we're going to talk about a few real-world examples. And like I said, only one of these is not online. The first is a Slack notification plugin. The second is something that was written to handle CrashPlan Pro E reporting in Jamf Pro. Then a Splunk plugin. And then Oliver's site assignment integration that he worked on. So the first one, Slack. This is one of mine. It's called Jackalope. Charles bought me this icon. Charles Edge, he bought me this icon, so that's the official badge for the project. It's out on the Jamf Marketplace, which got announced on Tuesday, sorry. That's the URL for it right there. The source code is all available on my GitHub repo, where you see right there. That link is also in the Marketplace. So if you want to go look at the code, you can just go browse it right now. So notification integrations. These are the absolute simplest thing in the world to do. It's the best way to get started if you're just learning this stuff, because really all you do is you take events in and then you pipe them back out. And you're just doing a little bit of translation from the data that you're getting in, putting in the format that Slack, HipChat, or whatever else wants, and then doing the post. Like I said before, some services, as a part of their API documentation, they have frameworks for being able to install them, which makes it easier to distribute them. So like for mine, I took advantage of Slack's installable framework, so that you click a link, it takes you to this, and you can add it into a channel on your team. And then when that happens, it pops in this little welcome message here, and it has a randomly generated URL to the server that's running the plugin, and that URL is only for messages that are for this Slack channel. So what you do is you go into Jamf Pro, and you create any of the webhooks that are supported by Jackalope that you want. You point them to this URL, and then Jackalope takes care of doing the format, of taking in the data, doing the formatting, and then giving you nice-looking notifications in your channels for any of these events you want. These are just a few examples. Computer, whoops, I can't really read that too well. Computer added, mobile device unenrolled, and then is that the patch? Oh yeah, patch definition updates. That patch definition updates were part of the version 9 webhooks. You also see that I've got some color coding in addition to the icons, just things that help make it all more identifiable. You can also see that there's some color coding there to call out whether or not something might actually require attention or if it's just a standard notification. So when we're talking about translating things between the two services, Slack has, for inbound notifications, it has its own syntax or its own schema for how you should format your JSON. So on the left is what we're getting in from Jamf Pro, and on the right is what needs to get translated into, because really it's just parsing together a whole bunch of strings and putting values in the right place. You can actually see how it's mapped to the notification on this slide here. So the different lines, this is how they map to in that notification that you just saw. So we have, where's my laser? There we go. I didn't have a clicker in my first presentation, so this is pretty nice. So, for the blue line here, what we got here? We got the title, and then for yellow, that's the message body. That's the message body, and then orange is the timestamp. So the time when the event was actually sent is created was done right here, and then that color coding is being defined right here, and then the icon actually is being provided a URL to where on the plugin server that icon is located. And all this is done really through mappings when events come in. There's just some functions that ends up getting passed through to determine what values need to go into the final JSON before it shoots it out. And again, if you've got it up on your computers, you can actually see what that all looks like. But straight notifications are really easy, because in reality, the only thing you need for an inbound webhook to a Slack room is the text field. You don't need all this other stuff. This is a special type of notification that they call an attachment. You can just get away with straight up text, but then you get no special formatting or anything with that, and it just looks like blobs of text being spilled into your room. So it's important to go through the documentation to see what you can do to make it a better experience. And again, most of the work is all being done with just Slack's API, not really anything about the webhook itself. So Splunk. This also is online. I forgot to replace that with a Jamfit link, but there is a shortened GitHub URL right here for this really long GitHub address. Joseph gave me this example, and he's posted it around Slack a few times. He wrote this before he left Splunk. And this is aggregating event data from Jamf Pro into Splunk to build reporting dashboards off of. So again, this is actually super simple. An event happens in Jamf Pro. Integration is doing a little bit of work to clean up what gets brought in, and then it makes an authenticated. Oh, I'm sorry. This has an extra step in it. It's going, because there's only so much detail that's provided in the webhook. It's actually taking the serial number, and then it's making a return request to Jamf Pro to get the full inventory record for that computer. Then after it does that, it makes an authenticated request to Splunk to pipe in the data for that computer. And really all it's doing is, after that webhook comes in, it grabs the full computer record, which you see on the left there. All they're really doing is they're stripping out a few key values, and they're dropping that top level computer key. And that doesn't really seem like a whole lot of work, but it actually makes things in Splunk a lot easier when building the reports, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So this is what they gave me some screenshots. Tanya over at Splunk, she gave me some screenshots. It was very kind of her. This is what they're able to build with all that aggregated data that they're getting piped into Splunk. And we're going to make that a little bit bigger so it's a little bit easier to see, because they got a lot of really cool stuff in here. They have dashboards for the spread of macOS versions. They've got the percentage of Jamf managed clients, clients that have ACID tags, which ones are file vault enabled, dashboards for time-based compliance items, and then for applications, the spread of versions for a bunch of key applications that are in their environment. It's really, really cool stuff. And the way that they're able to build this is just with this syntax in this pop-up screen that you see right here. And if you can see what they're doing, it's actually a little bit hard to read, but they're referencing the computer object, and it's all dot notation. So they're doing, it's actually a little hard to see. I can't see it on there at all. But they're just referencing the computer object with dot notation. But because they cleaned it up and dropped that top level key, so it's just those main keys for the computer record, it's a lot less typing at this step when they're building all these reports. And then you can see down here that they've got the time frame options. So if you actually want to view data from further back in time, all that data is already aggregated in there and it's all timestamped, so they just need to change those date values and they can alter their charts to show that snapshot in time for their managed environment. It's really cool stuff. It's a one-file plugin that he wrote, and it's just available out on GitHub at the URL that we had, which if you did have a chance to copy it, I can help you share that with you later. All right, now CrashPlan Pro E. This is the one that's not available. This is another one of mine. I never quite finished it because I left IT before it was done. This is all about replacing extension attributes for CrashPlan Pro E and no longer having them run client-side. How many people here use CrashPlan Pro E? How many here use extension attributes on the clients that are available in order to get reporting into Jamf Pro for smart groups and such? Yeah, we got some. So there are ways that you don't have to have the clients do any of that stuff. So if you go out in Jamf Nation right now, we have 11 extension attributes just for CrashPlan Pro E. And what all these extension attributes are doing, though, is that you have to embed credentials, read access credentials for your CrashPlan server into every single one of these scripts except for one. And then it's actually making API calls out to your CrashPlan Pro server in order to pull data, make some calculations, and then populate an extension attribute value that gets submitted with the recon. That can get really expensive if you're doing all of these because as part of the recon process, it has to do all of those API calls every single time. You might not even be able to do this in the first place because your CrashPlan Pro E server may not be directly accessible from the clients. But there is another, and then there's the fact that you're embedding credentials in a script that's coming down to the client and you're effectively handing over credentials, even if it's only in existence temporarily. There is a better way, though. You don't have to do any of this client side. All that we need to keep is this computer GUID extension attribute, which with CrashPlan, when you install it, it creates this little file in application support for CrashPlan, which contains this randomized identifier value, which is what it uses to identify the computer when it's checking into the server. So all we need is this, because it's just reading that and then populating it into an extension attribute. From there, what I was doing was I wrote a plugin to listen to computer check-in events, not just inventory, but computer check-in events. So when a computer check-in event occurred, my server was going to go back out, and just like the Splunk plugin, it was going to grab that full inventory record so I could get the extension attributes. Then it would use the GUID that it got for that computer. It would go out to CrashPlan Pro E, and it would grab all the data for that computer. And then for every single one of those extension attributes, it would do all the calculations for those extension attributes in one go from one API call, build an XML file for updating all the extension attributes themselves, and it would put them back to that computer record in Jamf Pro, which resulted in offloading all those extension attributes that were client-side scripts originally to a server-side workflow that was populating the data every time a computer checked in, even if the computer wasn't submitting a recon. And there was no overhead on the client, there was no overhead on Jamf Pro. This is all being done between the integration and CrashPlan. And this was one that I didn't get to finish, so it's not online. I don't have the source code available. Hopefully, if I get access to a CrashPlan Pro E instance again, I can finish this up. So I'm going to hand this off to Oliver now, and he's going to go into much more in-depth about building one of these solutions that he did for a client.
Thanks, Bryson.
I'm going to take that.
And I will talk really, really loud?
Oh, you're not mic'd up. I thought he was mic'd up.
Thanks, Bryson.
It's from mingling.
So I'm Oliver. I'm from Pro Services. I'm the architect on the team, and I have the coolest job at Jamf. So I get some really interesting problems when we get a new customer. Sometimes they have something weird that they need solved, so it might come to me. So we have this one district. I'm going to talk about their issue and kind of how we approach their problem, and kind of look a little deeper into how we kind of just figured out the basics, or how I figured out the basics of doing a webhook. Back at that time, there was not a lot of documentation and not a lot of open source stuff, so it's a lot easier now. So their issue is they needed automated site assignment, which, it's not the easiest thing to automate in the, just using the base product. So this is kind of an example. Bryson showed some super slick, like really flashy automations, integrations with other things. And I really love some of that stuff. This is a sort of a project where we had to sort of extend what Jamf Pro could do, right? We could have gone to product development and said, hey, we need this done, and wait 2 years and we would have gotten it. But we need to sort of inject some functionality. So webhooks implement basically a callback. So it just means you need to do something based on something that happened in this system. Okay, we'll let you know, and then you can do what you want with it. So I'm going to talk about the problem and look into how we coded the solution, and then talk about some of the tools and things that help you get these projects done. So here's their problem statement. We have 100,000 iPads. This is a big district, right? 800 schools. A lot of these things were donated. They were bought on grants that were specific to the school. We've got an asset management system, but it's really not up to date. There's no way we could ever tackle the clerical mountain of figuring out what's where, and come up with inventory spreadsheets of these things. And, some of these schools have tech staff and some have none, right? So it's not like there's some administrators sitting in these schools that are going to sort all these things out for us. So we need distributed site-based administration. There's no central administration of these devices. It's all happening at the school level. Got to be at the site level, which means those devices, when they get enrolled, have to get into a site. And there's not a lot of automation built into the product for that. So, we talked about the typical approaches, like, okay, just get the best spreadsheets you can, and we'll upload them into Apple School Manager, and, we'll have a separate pre-stage for each one, and, we'll put the site in there so that, so we're expecting these things. And they said, no. Or we said, if people, you can kind of tell from the IP address maybe, or the date and time, if people tell you when they're enrolling, you can kind of go in and sort of batch assign them to sites. And they said, no one's going to be sitting by a computer babysitting this thing. These things have got to be automatic, and it's got to be immediate too, because if you're an admin enrolling, your carts of devices, you want to be able to go into your Jamf dashboard and into inventory and see those things and see that they actually enrolled. So we said, okay, this is a perfect problem to solve with a webhook, right? Because we're going to get immediately notified when something interesting happens. And then we can inject our own sort of business logic and sort of enhance the product with it. So they said, okay, so how are we going to figure out what site they're in, right? Or what they should be in? They said, okay, well, when you go through the DEP process, you have to put in AD username and password. And it just so happens that in their AD, there is an attribute, it's a custom attribute, it's called business unit ID. So he said, how about if we look at that business unit ID, and that is going to tell us the site. Now, the business unit ID is just a code, right? So it's, and this, whereas the site name is, North High School or something useful like that instead of, 01238 or whatever. So all we had to do to get that business unit ID is do an LDAP map and go into our LDAP mappings. And it turned out that we didn't have any data for room, right? They didn't populate that in their AD. So we just said, well, just stick the business unit ID right in room. And then when that device inventories, we're going to have that in our user and location information for that device. So it just so happens that room is one of the elements that gets passed in the JSON for the mobile device enrolled webhook. So beautiful. I got everything I need. I know the JSS ID, and I know the room number, right, which is the business unit ID, and I can map that to a site. So we got a solution. We're good to go. So now we just have to write the thing, and I have to figure out how to do a webhook. So, I'm sure PHP would be appalling as a solution to Bryson. Although you could probably write some Python to write the PHP for me.
Sacrilege.
However, if you're not super whiz kid Bryson, which I'm not, And at this district, they said, hey, I said, what do you want to write it in? Write in whatever you want. They said, well, we got some people that kind of know some PHP, and we want them to be able to maintain it, and they've got a PHP server. So great, let's do PHP. Super accessible sort of web server programming language. Tons of easily Googleable for web little snippets of code and stuff like that. So I found this really, really simple to do. Every question I had as I was writing this thing, like first link in Google right there. Never had to go hunting for a thing. Okay, so we're going to write a PHP application. It's just going to sit on a web server. It's going to receive our mobile device enrolled event. So when it gets that event, it's going to have a business unit ID, which is actually a room for that user who just enrolled that device. And then we're going to use the API to write back to the JSS to assign the site on that device. Not real complicated, but we got to go through a couple steps. Okay, so the PHP is going to get that device ID. It's going to have to, when it gets that webhook, it's going to have to do some parsing, right? We're going to have to pluck that data out. And then there's a step, because I mentioned that the business unit ID is not the same as the site name, we got to do a little remapping. Fortunately, the site names, we decided we were all going to start them with the exact same code that's the business unit ID. So it might be 1234 North High School, for example. Fast forward past some of this fancy stuff. Okay, so iPad enrolls. It's going to hit DEP, and DEP is going to say, oh, you need to go register, get yourself enrolled with this Jamf server. As soon as that happens, the Jamf server is going to throw this webhook. And we've got to, in this case, we load balanced it, right? They wanted 100,000 devices. They wanted high availability. And they want to set it and forget it and not have a lot of admin overhead trying to keep, worry about, tending to the servers. So they insist on some HA. So throw that webhook. So the Jamf server, remember, when this device inventories, it's going to go out to AD, and it's going to pull up all our data, all our metadata attributes for that user who just enrolled that device. So we're going to know stuff like the business unit ID. It throws a webhook, hits a load balancer, goes to one of the two. They run their PHP server on Windows. All their backends are on Windows. So it hits one of those two servers. Now, important point here. I should go back. Back. Oh. So it does not matter what you run this in. It doesn't matter what language you use. You can write a web server on just about anything. And these REST clients, every tool you're going to, whatever tool you like, it's going to have it, right? Now I've got to get through this animation again.
I take it back. I didn't add these transitions.
Fancy, right? Yeah, I had a really boring deck. Someone spiced it up for me. So when I was developing on Apache. So you just need an OS, a web server, Apache or IIS, and PHP. That's it. PHP is an easy install. Not so easy on Windows, but any other OS, super easy. Okay, so let's take a look at how we receive a webhook, how we parse out that JSON event that we're going to get. Then we're going to have to get some more information from the Jamf API. Remember I said the site name is going to start with a site code, but I don't know from the webhook what the actual full site name is. We're going to parse that XML I want to show you how to parse some XML in PHP when we get that data back from the Jamf API, and then how we send our results, our site setting, back to the JSS. Okay, so look at the structure of the webhook. This is actually a big, long thing. Bryson had a slide of the new patch thing when I think it was in like 6 point. And I mean, there's a lot of data in there, but I don't care about most of it, right? It's data I don't need. But the basic structure is that there's two sort of chapters to this JSON book. We've got webhook information, and that tells me what the event was that we're getting, right? So I might have a big PHP that's doing lots of things on lots of event, but in this one, I'm just looking for mobile dice enrolled, right? That's the only one I care about for this workflow. And then in the event clause, I've got two fields that I care about: the room, which is the site code, and the JSS ID. That's the ID that I'm going to need when I write my XML back to the JSS to set the site. Okay, so all you got to do, open up your favorite text editor, save a file. All you have to do is, doesn't matter what you call it, but put .php at the end. What that does is when Apache or whatever your web server is gets that request for that page from a client, it's going to say, oh, I don't know what this file is, but it's not HTTP, so I'm not just going to spit it back to them. It has PHP at the end of it, and so I'm going to send this over to the PHP interpreter before I send a response to the client. So, and then I just put it in a folder. I created a folder in the web root on that server, and I just called it site set. Index PHP is just a handy thing to call because that auto loads. You can just go to the URL and type /site set, and it just finds it'll find whatever's called index, the first thing called index. Okay, so in our text file, you just put this little less than $PHP. There's a closing clause at the end, just like, HTML. So you're just tagging it and telling the interpreter, okay, anything inside these tags, process it. Okay, next thing is I'm going to be dealing with the API, which means I'm going to have a username and password to write back to my JSS. I do not want to stick that username and password in my code because that code is sitting on a web server. And I'm sure you've all, at one time or another, hit a web page and it had some error or the database was down or whatever, and you see just a big page of IIS, like, Visual Basic code just being spit back at you. And you're like, I really don't think I'm supposed to be seeing this right now. So you don't want that, right? You don't want to expose your passwords. So you just take your password out of your code and just put it in an INI file, right? So I just made a subfolder and said index.ini. And all I do is say, my base URL, here's the address for my URL, and here's my username and password. And that's nice because if I want to give this to someone else to run at their school, well, they just go into the INI file, put in their settings, and boom, they're done, right? So we're going to read all our settings out of there. So then back in our index PHP, that's our PHP file that's actually going to do the thing for us. It's real simple. There's a command called parse INI file. So you just give it the path to the INI, and then it basically reads anything in that INI file into an array. So we can just say, okay, so my base URL variable is going to be the JSS base URL element of the INI array. Okay, next step. We're getting this blob of JSON. I guess you could just grep it and do substrings and say, give me the first 5 characters after you find the word ID. That is a bad way to parse a structured data transfer language, right? PHP has built-in JSON decode, right? So all you do is you say, okay, I want to get the input, the body of this webhook that just came in. So there's a command for that. It's built-in. File get contents, PHP input. So I'm just putting that in a variable called JSON. And then I use the JSON decode command. Does the same thing as sort of the INI parser, right? It just takes that JSON and puts it into an associative array. So associative array is just an array that has named elements, right? Which makes it really easy to pluck out what I want. So remember, in our webhook, we've got 2 clauses, right? We've got the webhook part up at the top as a header, and then the event. So I want to get the device ID. I just say JSON array in event, in the event clause, there's this field called JSS ID, and just assign that to a variable. Same thing for site code. Okay, next issue. The business unit ID in AD is not the same as the site name, but it does start with that code, right? So I want to go out to the JSS and get a list of the available sites. So this is just an example I wanted to show you that you can, in your webhook, you can go out to the JSS and read some data in from the API to sort of supplement what you got about the device from the webhook. So curl init to set, there's actually an option missing here. We have to do a username and password, but set the URL, set the header to, say we want XML back, and then it's just curl exec, right? And whatever we get back from the API is going to go in a variable called returned XML. Okay, now, just like we parsed that JSON, now we're going to parse some XML. So we just create an object. We're going to say simple XML element, and we're going to put our returned XML that we got from the API, and we're going to put that in an object handle called XML underscore. You don't have to put an underscore at the end of your variables. I just do that when I create objects. And then we can use the XPath built in to extract very precisely a path from our XML. So in this case, we want to get site. We want to get the name that starts with the text of our site code. This is XPath is a language in and of itself, but this took some Googling to find, but this is how you sort of find the first thing that starts with a string using XPath notation. And then I just take that result, turn it into a string, and assign it to the site name. So now I know the site name of the site, I know the ID of the device that enrolled, I'm good to go. So I just copy and pasted some XML in, and then just where I need to put in the site name, I just put in my site name variable. And in addition, we decided, since we know the site name and we're writing to the API anyway, let's go ahead and put that same exact value into an extension attribute. And that's going to allow us to create some smart groups, like I can create a smart group for anything that belongs to the school, or I'd create a smart group of anything that's been enrolled in the last day but doesn't have a site. Like maybe there's a problem in their user's AD data or something like that. Maybe they didn't get the business unit assigned or whatever. So it's really easy to sort of pluck out things that went right and went wrong. Not that anything ever goes wrong. Okay, so last example of code. I'm sure you're all disappointed. It's the fascinating part. So this is the same thing, but it's just an example of using PHP to write to the API. It's using the same sort of curl package that we use to read our site information from the API. So we're just going to initialize our curl session, set a couple options. We're going to set the URL we're writing to, the username and password. We have to put in our HTTP method, which in this case is put, right? And then a little header just to say, hey, Jamf API, we're going to be sending you some XML. Here it comes. Okay, so our curl opt post field, that's our data package, right? So if you ever use like curl from the bash command line, you usually have a dash data and give it your XML variable. That's the same thing in PHP. And then we're just going to get our return code by calling curl exec. Okay. Now, we got to enable our webhook. All you do is you go into settings, go down to webhooks, and I put in two here. So the first one is this, I don't know if you can read it, but there's this website called request-b-in. It's basically a webhook catcher, right? It doesn't do anything with it. It just, if you're going to be throwing a webhook, you want to see what it looks like, you're not sure if your PHP is set up right or whatever, and you just want to just kind of troubleshooting, know that the thing got thrown, you can put in as many webhooks for mobile device enrolled as you want, right? So just send one off to this thing. You just register for it and it lasts for 24 hours, and it'll just show you the contents of whatever was spit out, right? And then I put in the one for my actual webhook, phpschool-edu/siteset, which is my PHP script, right? The path to my PHP script. Okay, so toolkit to write this stuff. Not a lot. You don't need a lot. I need a web browser. So you can hit the PHP site and just make sure your Apache is set up and PHP is installed correctly and stuff like that. Use whatever editor you want. Just get a real editor. And then the next thing you need, so when I wrote my first version, I was like, oh, well, great, got my iPad, let's enroll it. So, roll it, and like, well, it didn't work. I'm going to have to do some troubleshooting. I said, oh, well, here's what I need to fix. Boom, fix it. And it's like, I'm looking at the iPad. I'm like, okay, by the time I'm done, I'm going to run through about 100 test iterations. I'm not going to enroll this iPad 100 times. So you just get a REST client. And basically, what that does is you can tell this REST utility to throw the exact same webhook that your JSS is going to be throwing. I use one called Postman. There's a few other of them out there. So in Postman, this tool was really helpful to me. So all you got to do is two things. You open it up, click new. You got to set a header, right? We've got to tell our PHP app that it should be expecting some JSON. And then you go over to the body tab and you paste in some, an actual JSON snippet. That's kind of simulates exactly what the JSS is going to be throwing out. I edited it down, and this is really easy because I can try all sorts of different things. Like, what if I give it a username, but I don't give it a site? Or you could try it with different devices by just adjusting the JSS ID and just keep hitting send until you're happy with it. Okay, this thing's got one other handy feature that came in handy to me. So up in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, right under the send button, there's this little link called code. So you hit that, and it'll spit out basically the same webhook that you just wrote, except it'll spit it out in whatever language you want. So I wanted to do some load testing, right? I just wanted to get a quick command line curl to do the exact same webhook that the JSS is going to be throwing out. But I can't get 1,000 people to enroll 1,000 devices at the same second. But I can take this little code snippet and put it in a loop and bash and just start smashing the servers with it. Okay, and then, the JSS does not care if your webhook responds with anything back, right? It's not listening. But when you're debugging, it's super handy. So you can actually write echo information back, like, okay, I got a webhook, here's what I parsed out for site code, and that can be really useful to you. You're not going to see that if you're just enrolling a device because the JSS isn't logging it anywhere. But you can do it here. You can go over to the results tab and you'll see it. And then you go into your inventory record and you look at your site extension attribute and your site, and they are both set. Kaboom! If you want this, there's a couple examples on source up on GitHub. Just Google GitHub Jamf Professional Services and the webhook. There's a webhooks folder there. There's one that's sort of just simple, basic little code snippets, and one that's got logging and lots of bells and whistles.
Hit that next slide. So we're
Q&A.
Yeah, we're really short on time here, but the next session, the next workshop session that was the webhook workshop, it was never really meant to be a workshop per se. It was meant to be an open discussion period where if you had more questions about this, or you were having issues, or you just wanted to bounce ideas around, come upstairs, Lake Harriet. That's where I'm going to be. And there's I don't know if Oliver wants to hang around. Maybe he can just come to the party. But you can come up there. If you're not going to another session, come to the workshop. There is no 15-person limit. Just if we can get the standing room, that's fine. Come upstairs. We can talk through some ideas and other things webhook related.
Cool.
But we do got 2 minutes if anyone wants to ask a question.
I guess we can take one question.
I thought I heard you say that you had to post XML to the JSS, but it looked like you were doing JSON. So I don't. Either one.
No, you can only post XML to the JSS, but you can get JSON and XML from the API and as a webhook. But you can only post or put to the JSS with XML.
Okay.
Hi there, a question for Oliver. So if there were going to be no admins at the schools, why not just use why not just use static groups instead of sites?
So they wanted the admin or whoever's doing the enrolling, the teacher or whatever, if vice principal might be supervising this thing, right? They wanted them to be able to go into the JSS right away and see the device enrolled, right? But they only have site access. They're not full admins. So they wouldn't be able to see, unless that device is deposited into a site by something or someone, they'll never see it, right? So, could have done pre-stages and had different and different entry in Apple School Manager for every school, but we didn't have inventory, right? We didn't even know what serial numbers were at half the schools. So, but talk to me after, because if you've got a better way, I want to hear it.
Cool.
When a computer policy completes, does it send the ID number of the policy?
No, and there is a feature request for that.
Okay.
There is a feature request,
He
and
got
I've
us.
talked to them about making that webhook better to include contextual data about the policy itself.
Okay. Any current workarounds?
I wrote something really hacky once, which kind of worked.
Okay.
There's also another gotcha with Computer Policy Complete right now, which I also have let them know about that they need to fix. It only sends if it was a success. It doesn't send if it was a failure.
Okay.
So those are two issues that I've made the developers aware of, and hopefully they will get addressed at some point. But feature requests on JF Nation, go upvote them.
Do you know the numbers or the names?
I do not.
Okay.
I'd have to go look them up.
But you authored them?
I didn't. Well, I can't actually do public feature requests
Oh.
because I'm a Jamf employee.
Okay.
But I can harass them on HipChat.
Thank you.
And you could automate it.
All right, thank you,
That's an idea.
Oliver and Bryson. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much.